Hello, welcome to New Support for SEND, and we are the Educational Psychology Service, and we have a short presentation here about social stories that we'd like to share with you. My name is Shanice Benito, an educational psychologist, and
My name is Alice Zaniolo, trainee educational psychologist.
we are from Newham Educational Psychology Service.
First of all, we would like to briefly reflect on the implications of the coronavirus pandemic for the well-being of children and young people. In particular, going back to school after lockdown is likely to trigger feelings of uncertainty or even anxiety. The transition from safety and comfort at home to the out there might be particularly frightening for children and young people. There are likely to be changes in school settings, key adults, and peer groups, as well as change in routines and user spaces. There might also be worries and possible recurring thoughts around illness and death. Additionally, there might be anxieties around academic achievement. As a result of the current context and of particularly difficult or traumatic experiences, or because of special educational needs, some pupils might be particularly vulnerable to managing anxiety, or they might manifest difficulties around flexibility and coping with change. They might experience difficulties processing and verbalizing emotional needs, or show difficulties in planning and organizing, or they might have social communication difficulties in asking for help and receiving verbal support. Therefore, emotional support is particularly important at this stage, and preparation is key.
So, how might social stories help? So, social stories present information in a literal, concrete way. They're a set of explicit guidelines which really help to improve the child's understanding of a previously difficult or ambiguous situation or activity. So, if you've noticed an area of concern that you think children may need help with, social stories can be very beneficial for that child. They can help with sequencing, so planning what happens now and what happens next, so that that child can plan and organize their processes and how they may go about a certain situation that they may find difficult. By providing information about what might happen in a particular situation and some guidelines for behavior, we can hope to reduce anxiety. Creating or using a social story can help us to understand from the individual or from the child's perspective about situations that they may find difficult. So, what are social stories? They were created by Carol Gray in 1991, and they're short descriptions of a particular situation or activity, a targeted area that you'd like to focus on, so that child doesn't receive a set of complicated instructions, but on just one key area to focus on. They need to be personalized for that child so that they can actually relate to the story. And they need to include information on what to expect and why. What is the rationale for why we want them to adopt this behavior? They can be used for a range of purposes, so routine, empathy, to provide positive feedback for behavior strategies, and especially self care skills, particularly when washing hands or social distancing comes into play. So, how do they work? So, think about a time when you typically read a social story or a story in particular with children. So, it could be on the carpet, it could be next to a bookshelf, it could be at a desk, or at home, it could be on the sofa in the living room. And try to introduce the story in ways such as, I have written this story for you, or remember the story we wrote together? It's about wearing a mask. Let's read it together now. And allow pauses after each sentence to encourage the child's reflections and questions. And after reading the social story with that child, return to the story when deemed necessary. So it could be that the child's forgotten a set of instructions, or the child themselves may bring up that they want to read a certain story. Or you might want to read the social story during targeted situations. So maybe before playtime, you might read the social story with a child.
Let's now think about how to use social stories. First, if you're looking for resources, Carol Gray's guidelines on how to use social stories effectively are a great resource you can refer to. For now, here are some tips on how to use social stories. 1. Think about ways to aid comprehension. Would adding questions help? Or maybe replacing some text with blanks for the person to fill in? 2. Encourage ownership of the story for the child or young person. For example, by giving them the chance to add some drawings. Find ways to support the story. For example, you could create a poster with a key phrase from the story. Also, plan how often and where the story will be reviewed with the person so that it can become embedded in positive everyday routines. 5. Monitor how well the story is received and whether it is working as intended. For example, by asking the child or young person for feedback or observing their reactions. Finally, keep your stories organized in a ring binder or computer folder. This makes them easier to find and review and to develop with new information. And how to write a social story. First of all, set the goal. What is it that you would like to accomplish through the use of the social story? Then collect information about the situation you want to describe in your social story. Where does the situation occur? Who is it with? How does it begin and end? How long does it last? And what actually happens in the situation and why? And then tailor the text by structuring it into title, introduction, main body, and ending. Note that it is recommended to use simple, straightforward, and supportive language. Also, remember to use short sentences. It might be helpful to think of your sentences as if answering uh, who, where, what, when, how, and why questions. Use at least 2 descriptive sentences to every quoting directive sentence, and we will come back to this shortly. Try to always end on a positive statement. Finally, add pictures, either symbols, photographs, or drawings, or a combination of these, to support the child's understanding and to make the story more engaging. And as we were saying before, it's very important that the child is at the center of the process and can feel involved and engaged. We can accomplish this by gathering information, for example, about the context details, the child's favorite activities, their toys, their friends. We can also involve the child by constructing the story with them, while at the same time being mindful of the child's developmental needs. It is important to involve the child in deciding when to use the story, taking photographs to be used in the story, or asking the child to make some drawings or to color the pictures. And we can also make sure that the story time is an enjoyable shared activity.
So there are different types of sentences that are typically included within a social story. So I'd like to go through the range of sentences that are typically within a social story. So the first sentence that I'd like to talk about are descriptive sentences. So these tend to describe the situation, who is there, what happens. So for example, I sit on the carpet with my class when it is time for maths lesson. The next sentence that I'd like to talk about are perspective sentences, and they describe the internal state, feelings, and beliefs of that child so that we understand where they're coming from. Where are these uncertainties stemming from? And then perspective sentences most frequently refer to the internal status of other people. So we're developing that empathy there for that child. So, for example, they could be calling out can disrupt my class, or I feel frustrated when maths work is hard. The next type of sentence are directive coaching sentences, and these are the backbone of social stories. They guide behavior, they're instructional. So, for example, I can put my hand up when I want help from my teacher. And the last sentence that I'd like to touch on are positive statements. So these are the rationale behind the behavior that we want that child to adopt. So why should they adopt this behavior? So for example, putting my hand up will let my teacher know I want her help. And here we've got a lovely example of a social story that may be applicable, especially during the pandemic, about going back to school. This can be used when children go back to school in September, for example. So have a look and see if you can spot any of the sentences that we mentioned earlier. From worries to social stories. So there are a lot of uncertainties in terms of going back to school, and the anxiety that children may feel may be present when going back to school. So transition from safety and comfort in the house to being out there may be something that children may feel when going back to school. So social stories such as going on the bus, crossing the road may be helpful. Changes in school settings, key adults and peer groups may be prevalent for children. So it may be helpful to develop a social story around sharing, turn taking, how to greet others. Changes in routines and use of spaces, so how to use playground equipment efficiently and effectively and safely. Worries and possible recurring thoughts around illness, so self care help skills may be helpful there. So, washing hands, how to have social distancing parameters in place with social stories may be helpful. And then anxiety around academic achievement. So, for example, children may feel frustrated if they're faced with challenging work, so they may call out in class. So, maybe a social story around how to put a hand up, who to talk to when we need help from with our work. That might be helpful in terms of creating social stories in those areas.
And here's a summary of some key recommendations. So, as we mentioned before, the presentation and content should be adapted to meet the child's individual needs. For example, we might need to use words that the child is familiar with. It's important to avoid negative language and to adapt language and pictures to support the child's understanding. As we said, it's important to use the child's interests, for example, cartoon characters, toys, or special places, so that we can keep the child motivated and interested. It's recommended to use the first person, so I, we, to use at least 2 descriptive sentences to every coaching directive sentence, and to always end on a positive.
So, other strategies to support transition for pupils may be comic strip conversations, and these are quite useful because children find it quite fun to actually create these conversations, and they help with social interaction skills. A virtual tour of the school may be helpful if children have not been to school since March 2020. It might be helpful to develop that sense of safety and regularity by becoming accustomed to what the school may look like now. A buddy system is helpful for friendships and social skills. Nurture principles in school may be helpful to create that sense of safety and comfort within schools. Transitional objects may be helpful in terms of transitioning from home to school. A staggered return may be useful for vulnerable pupils. And of course, please do contact the EPS and refer to the local offer for more information. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation and thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.